Have you ever watched certain people move through life and wondered how everything seems to align perfectly for them, almost as if reality itself bends around their footsteps? They start a business that others laughed at, and within a couple of years, they're not just surviving, they're dominating entire markets while seasoned veterans struggle to stay afloat. They pick up a creative skill, something most people take years to become decent at, and within months their work looks polished, refined, almost professional. They step into competitive environments, sports, art, leadership, academics, anything, and while others grind for years trying to inch forward, these individuals rise like they're being pulled upward by invisible strings. And every time someone witnesses this, the same tired explanations get repeated over and over again. They're lucky. They had better opportunities. They started with money. They must have natural talent. These statements sound comforting because they allow us to believe mastery is unreachable unless fortune kisses us first. You've probably heard people say these things hundreds of times. Maybe, at some point, you've even said them yourself. But what if all these excuses, luck, money, connections, talent, are nothing more than illusions we cling to so we don't have to face a harder truth? What if the real difference between extraordinary performers and average strugglers has almost nothing to do with external advantages? What if the gap isn't about circumstances, but perception? The people who excel at everything they touch aren't just working harder, they're seeing differently. They've cultivated a way of perceiving the world that most people never develop. In Japan, ancient masters had a name for this rare ability, mitsuku, a form of seeing that doesn't depend solely on the eyes, but draws upon a unified intelligence of mind, body, and spirit. It's not some mystical superpower. It's not spiritual fantasy or poetic metaphor. It's a psychological and physiological transformation, a trained form of awareness that shifts how you interpret reality, how you respond to challenges, and how quickly you adapt to new skills. This ability allowed Japanese warriors to outthink, outmove, and outperform opponents who were often stronger or more experienced. And here's the fascinating part, they didn't treat Mitsuku as a mystery. They created a structured, step-by-step path to cultivate it. A literal system, a map for turning an ordinary human perception into something sharp, fluid, intuitive, and deeply intelligent. But here's the uncomfortable catch. Following this system requires you to confront truths about yourself that might feel like an attack on your ego. It forces you to question everything you think you know about practice, discipline, and improvement. It demands that you let go of the idea that intellectual understanding equals mastery. It asks you to accept that your mind, as you use it today, may actually be the very thing limiting your growth. And before we explore this ancient path of mastery, before we dive into the system that shaped some of the greatest warriors in Japan's history, I want you to pause for a moment. Look inward. Ask yourself, what is the skill you've been trying to master but keep getting stuck in? Maybe it's a business you can't scale. Maybe it's a creative craft you've worked on for years but never feel good enough at. Maybe it's discipline, communication, fitness, focus, anything. Because once you recognize the skill that frustrates you the most, the teachings you're about to hear will hit you much deeper. Now that we've opened that door, let's step forward together into the ancient knowledge that less than 1% of people today even attempt to understand, let alone master. Centuries ago, long before modern cities, electricity, or convenience shaped the rhythm of human life, Japan existed in a world carved by conflict and discipline. It was the Sengoku period, an age where war was not an event but a constant atmosphere, drifting through every village like a silent wind. In this era lived a young boy named Kenji, whose story would one day be told in whispers across generations. Kenji was not born into privilege. He wasn't the son of a samurai, nor did he belong to a respected warrior clan. He had no mentors, no advantages, no wealthy patrons who could open doors for him. All he possessed was a fierce, almost consuming obsession that set him apart from every child in his village. From the moment he was old enough to understand the world, one dream consumed him, to become a master swordsman. While other boys laughed, played, and resigned themselves to the simple futures awaiting them, farming, fishing, trading, Kenji drifted toward a different destiny. Whenever a samurai or traveling warrior passed through the village, Kenji was there, watching from behind trees or rooftops, memorizing every stance and every subtle shift of balance. He would trace their steps in the dirt, mimicking their motions long after they had gone. At night, when others slept, Kenji sat under lamplight studying old scrolls and tales of legendary duels. He devoured the teachings of great swordsmen like Miyamoto Musashi, not because he understood everything, but because he felt a calling he couldn't explain. By 16, Kenji could recite entire passages of warrior philosophy, strategy, and discipline. He knew the names of ancient strikes and stances, the theories behind footwork, and the mental principles of Bushido. His mind overflowed with knowledge, but knowledge alone is not skill. When he picked up a wooden bakken to practice, his body betrayed him. Movements he had studied for years felt clumsy, stiff, even embarrassing. Where he expected elegance, he found awkwardness. Where he imagined precision, he found imbalance. The sword felt heavy in his hands, like it belonged to someone else. He knew what to do, but he couldn't do it. For 2 long years, Kenji lived in this tormenting contradiction. The more he learned, the more painfully he became aware of how far he truly was from mastery. Others who trained casually surpassed him with ease. And as he watched them grow while he remained stuck, a quiet despair settled inside him. Was passion alone not enough? Was he simply not born for this path? Everything changed one afternoon when Kenji was practicing alone deep in the forest. His movements were rigid, his breathing uneven, frustration pooling inside him with every failed repetition. Suddenly, a voice cut through the silence, not loud, but sharp enough to freeze him in place. You move like a man reciting poetry he has never understood. Kenji spun around to see an elderly warrior standing under the shade of a cedar tree. A ronin, masterless, weathered, and perceptive. The man's presence radiated a quiet power that made the forest feel smaller. The old warrior introduced himself as Teisher, a swordsman who had once served lords in distant provinces before choosing the lonely road of a wanderer. He looked at Kenji not with judgment, but with recognition. He saw in this boy the same hunger he once carried, along with the same mistake. You have studied techniques, Teisher said, but you have never learned them. You are trying to grasp the sword with your mind alone. That is why your body refuses to follow. You believe the mind is one thing. The ancient masters knew it is 3. And that single moment, unexpected, magical, almost fate-like, became the beginning of the journey that would change Kenji's destiny forever. Teisher led Kenji to a quiet clearing deep within the forest, a place where the wind seemed to whisper through the trees and the world moved at a slower, more deliberate pace. The old ronin sat down on the moss-covered ground and motioned for Kenji to sit as well. What happened next would reshape Kenji's understanding of learning, discipline, and the nature of the self. Teisher began by explaining that the flaw in Kenji's training wasn't lack of effort or lack of knowledge, it was the assumption that the mind he had been using was the only mind that existed. You believe the mind is one, he said gently, but the ancient masters discovered there are 3. Kenji frowned, unable to imagine what that meant. Teisher picked up a stick and drew 3 circles in the dirt. He pointed to the first. This is the thinking mind, Shin. This is the mind you've depended on your entire life. It learns through logic, study, information, memorization. It is useful, but it is slow. It is noisy. And worst of all, it does not know how to move. He gestured toward Kenji's wooden sword. You have tried to swing this using thought, and thought is always a step behind action. By the time your thinking mind tells your body what to do, the moment has already passed. Then he pointed to the second circle. This is the body-mind, Tai. This intelligence lives in the muscles, in your bones, in the nervous system that reacts before you consciously understand why. The body-mind speaks the language of movement. It learns through repetition, not explanation. When you watch a master whose movements appear effortless, fluid, and perfectly timed, you are watching the body-mind at work. Finally, Teisher tapped the smallest but deepest circle. His voice grew softer, almost reverent. And this is the spirit mind, Shinshin. This is the mind beneath thought. It is the awareness that notices but does not judge, that perceives without effort, that moves without hesitation. The ancient masters called this state Mushin, no mind. It is not emptiness, but clarity. Not thoughtlessness, but unbroken presence. At this level, there is no you performing a technique, there is only action happening through you. Kenji listened, mesmerized and confused at the same time. He had never considered that his struggles came from using the wrong type of intelligence. But how do I train these other minds, he asked. I only know how to study with my thinking mind. Teacher gave a sad smile, the smile of someone who had once made the same mistake. That is exactly why you are stuck, he said. Your entire life, you have been taught to learn with only one mind. School teaches you to memorize. Books teach you to understand. Society praises those who can explain. But none of this creates mastery. It creates thinkers who cannot move. Teacher crushed one of the drawn circles with his hand. The thinking mind is not the enemy. It is just not the master. True skill requires all three minds in unity, thought guiding form, the body expressing it, and the spirit shaping intention. He took Kenji's Bakken and placed it gently into the young man's hands. Every great warrior, every true master in any craft, whether swordsmanship, art, leadership, or life, passed through the same path. A path the ancients called the three gates. Each gate awakens one of the minds. Pass through them completely, and the three become one. Fail to pass through even a single gate, and you will forever remain trapped in the illusion of knowledge. Kenji felt a shiver run through him. For the first time, he understood that mastery wasn't about talent or luck. It was about transforming the very way he perceived and experienced reality. And sitting there in the stillness of the forest, he made a silent promise: whatever this path required, whatever discomfort or discipline demanded of him, he would walk it without fear. Tishi's training truly began with what he called the first gate, a threshold few students ever crossed because it demanded something modern people almost never practice: absolute, unwavering repetition. Not the kind of repetition that most learners claim to do, where they casually practice a technique a few times and assume they understand it. This was different. This was devotion. This was purification through monotony. Teacher handed Kenji a wooden Bakken and said, "For the next 6 months, you will practice only one kata. One single pattern. No variety. No creativity. No improvisation. The thinking mind must be silenced so the body mind can awaken." Kenji thought he understood. He didn't. The kata seemed simple at first, just a sequence of steps and cuts. But teacher demanded a level of precision that bordered on obsession. The angle of the wrist, the placement of the feet, the timing of each breath, everything had to be exact. If your wrist is off by even the width of a grain of rice, teacher would say, your entire form is broken. And so Kenji repeated the kata slowly, painfully slowly, until hours blurred into days. The forest clearing became a sanctuary of discipline. The sound of the wooden blade cutting through air echoed between the trees like a heartbeat. At first, Kenji's thinking mind resisted. Every practice session felt like a battle inside his head. Thoughts flooded him: this is too simple. I already know this. I should be learning advanced techniques. I've read so much, why am I stuck repeating the basics? But teacher refused to let him move on. Your thoughts are trying to protect your ego, the old Ronin said. Mastery begins when ego is dissolved through discipline. Weeks passed. The simplicity of the kata became a mirror, reflecting every flaw Kenji had been blind to. His shoulders tensed. His steps were uneven. His breathing was inconsistent. Every mistake felt magnified. But with each correction, with each repetition, his movements slowly became cleaner. Still, he felt frustrated, not because he wasn't improving, but because he realized how shallow his understanding had been. Months went by, and Kenji practiced until his muscles trembled. The villagers who walked past the edges of the forest whispered about the boy who trained from sunrise to sunset without rest. His hands blistered, then bled, then hardened. The sword grew lighter in his grip, as though it had become an extension of his arm. And then, one quiet morning, something extraordinary happened. Kenji moved through the entire kata flawlessly, but he hadn't been thinking. Not even for a moment. The body-mind had taken over. T-shirt saw it instantly. His eyes, usually sharp and stern, softened with pride. "Now," he said, "your body speaks. You have taken your first step into the second mind." What Kenji had experienced was something modern neuroscience now describes as procedural memory, the moment when conscious control transfers into the deeper regions of the brain responsible for fluid, instinctive movement. But the Japanese masters had understood this centuries earlier, long before laboratories existed. They knew the body had its own intelligence, and that intelligence could only awaken when the mind released control. When Kenji tried to analyze what had just happened, the moment vanished. The kata grew clumsy again. T-shirt laughed gently. "Do not grasp at it," he said. "Flow is like a shadow. Chase it, and it disappears. Move naturally, and it follows." From that day on, Kenji understood that the first gate wasn't about technique, it was about transformation. It forced him to confront his impatience, his doubts, and his dependence on intellectual understanding. It broke down the part of him that believed mastery was something he could think his way into. By the end of 6 months, he had performed the kata thousands of times. And while the movements were the same as the first day, Kenji was not. The boy who began the journey had been replaced by someone quieter, stronger, more aware. Someone ready for the next gate. Someone whose awakening had only just begun. If the first gate forged Kenji's precision, the second gate shattered every illusion he had about control. After 6 months of rigid repetition, T-shirt abruptly changed everything. One morning, instead of instructing Kenji to perform the familiar kata, the old Ronin attacked him without warning. The strike came from the side, swift, sharp, and completely unpredictable. Kenji stumbled backward, barely raising his Bakken in time. His heart pounded. "Welcome," T-shirt said calmly, "to the second gate. Here, nothing is certain. Everything changes." The training that followed was unlike anything Kenji had imagined. Gone were the slow, meditative repetitions. Gone were the clean lines and predictable steps. Instead, T-shirt introduced chaos. Some days he attacked from behind. Other days he struck low, then high, then feinted without reason. He switched weapons constantly, a long staff one moment, a short blade the next. Sometimes he fought with 2 swords, sometimes with none at all. Kenji never knew what was coming. And that was the point. "A warrior who depends on fixed patterns is already dead," T-shirt said. "The world does not follow your script. You must learn to feel the truth of the moment." At first, Kenji struggled desperately. His body wanted to rely on the kata he had mastered, but the kata belonged to stillness, not chaos. Every time he tried to consciously think about the right response, he was too slow. Every time he hesitated, he was struck. His frustration grew heavier each day, filling him with doubt. But T-shirt pushed him harder. He added multiple attackers, 2 villagers with wooden poles, sometimes 3, occasionally even 4. They were untrained, unpredictable, wild. Their attacks had no pattern, no elegance, no rhythm for Kenji to follow. And because T-shirt instructed them to surprise him, Kenji found himself reacting to pure unpredictability. At first, he failed miserably. He tripped, stumbled, misjudged distances, and was thrown to the ground more times than he could count. Yet slowly, something inside him began to change. Instead of thinking, he began sensing. Instead of planning, he began responding. His movements grew lighter, freer, less forced. He learned Ma'ai, the subtle and invisible dance of timing, distance, and intention. He began noticing the slightest shifts in weight, the tiniest movements of an attacker's shoulder, the quietest exhale before a strike. These tiny signals, imperceptible to an untrained person, became loud to Kenji's awakening body-mind. Sometimes, he moved before he consciously saw the attack. Other times, he blocked a strike without knowing how he did it. Tisha recognized these moments instantly. "Good," he said. "Your body-mind is beginning to think for you. Now you must trust it." Trusting it was the hardest part. Every time Kenji doubted himself, he reacted too late. Every time he surrendered to instinct, he moved effortlessly. Weeks turned into months, and the once awkward boy who struggled to perform a simple kata had transformed into someone fluid and adaptive. He no longer waited for an attack, he felt it arriving. His reactions were quicker, sharper, more intelligent, guided not by analysis but by embodied intuition. Tisha often attacked without warning, testing Kenji's awareness. Sometimes Kenji parried before he even realized the strike had begun. Other times he sidestepped so smoothly it seemed choreographed. This, Tisha explained one evening as they sat beneath the fading sunset, is the awakening of the second mind. Skill is not about memorizing perfect movements, it is about adapting to imperfect reality. Modern practitioners would call this flow. Athletes describe it as the zone, musicians as pure improvisation. But to the ancient warriors, it was proof that the body-mind had awakened, an intelligence far deeper than thought. By the time Kenji completed the second gate, he was no longer just practicing swordsmanship. He was learning how to perceive the world with his entire being. And though he didn't yet know it, the greatest transformation, the awakening of the spirit mind, was still waiting beyond the next gate. The third gate began without ceremony. There was no bow, no lesson, no warning. Tisha simply led Kenji deep into the forest behind the dojo, far beyond the training grounds, far beyond any place Kenji had ever been. The deeper they walked, the quieter the world became, until even the birdsong faded into a distant whisper. Finally, at a lonely clearing marked only by a single weathered stone, Tisha stopped. "From this point onward," he said, "your greatest enemy will not be another swordsman. It will be your own mind." For the next hour, Tisha explained almost nothing. Instead, he instructed Kenji to sit on the cold ground, close his eyes, and remain completely still. "Do not move," he said. "Not even an inch." At first, Kenji thought it would be easy. But after only minutes, his legs ached, his back stiffened, and his thoughts grew loud and restless. Every discomfort screamed for attention. Every small sound tugged at his focus. His mind wandered through memories, worries, ambitions, fears, anything to escape the stillness. After what felt like hours, Tisha finally spoke. "This is the third gate, the spirit gate. Until now, you have trained your body and awakened your instinct. But unless your spirit is steady, both will crumble the moment fear enters your heart." And fear did enter. In the days that followed, Tisha introduced a new kind of training, one Kenji had never imagined. Instead of drills or combat, he was made to face silence, isolation, darkness, and uncertainty. Tisha would blindfold him and leave him alone in the forest at dusk with nothing but the sound of wind and the shifting of unseen animals. He would sit in pitch darkness for hours while his imagination conjured terrifying shapes between the trees. He would stand at the edge of a cliff, feeling only the wind against his skin, learning to trust stillness instead of panic. At first, fear controlled him completely. His breath would quicken. His mind would race. Shadows felt alive. Every crack of a twig sent him into alarm. When Tisha finally returned each night, Kenji felt ashamed. "I tried to stay calm," he said. "But the fear, it feels bigger than me." Tisha shook his head. "Fear is never the enemy. Attachment is. You are afraid because you cling to comfort, to control, to safety. Let go of all three, and the fear dissolves." The next evening, the training intensified. Tisha circled Kenji slowly, speaking in a low voice, "In true battle, fear kills more warriors than blades. Even the strongest lose themselves when the mind fractures. If your spirit collapses, your skill is meaningless." Then, without warning, he struck a wooden staff against a tree, the sound exploding in the silence. Kenji's breath caught. His heart pounded. But T-shirt only said, "Good. Feel the fear fully. Do not run from it." Night after night, Kenji sat with the fear, until something gradually began to shift. It didn't disappear. But it lost its claws. The darkness no longer felt like a threat, it felt like a teacher. The sounds of the forest became familiar instead of frightening. He learned to breathe deeply, letting his awareness expand rather than shrink. He realized fear was not something to be defeated, it was something to be understood. One night, as clouds drifted across the moon and the forest bathed in pale silver light, T-shirt asked, "What do you feel now?" Kenji closed his eyes. "Not fear," he said softly. "Just presence." T-shirt smiled for the first time. "Then the spirit gate has opened. A warrior who is no longer shaken by fear can see reality as it is, not as the mind distorts it." Kenji didn't fully grasp it yet, but he sensed he had crossed a threshold. His body had strength. His instinct had awakening. But now, his spirit had steadiness. And with that, he was finally ready for the final transformation, the merging of all three minds into one. With the spirit gate opening like a quiet dawn, Kenji entered a stage of training unlike anything he had imagined. T-shirt no longer corrected his stance, his grip, or his timing. Instead, he watched with an unreadable calm, as if observing something beneath the surface of Kenji's movements rather than the movements themselves. Days changed into weeks, and a strange shift began inside Kenji, subtle at first, then unmistakable. He realized that his actions were becoming less deliberate and more natural, as though something deeper than thought was directing him. T-shirt sensed this and began to melt the boundaries of practice. Some days he would wake Kenji before sunrise and guide him into slow, meditative sword movements, not speaking a single word. Other days, he would suddenly launch into an attack during chores or while Kenji was eating. Not to harm him, but to test whether Kenji's body responded before his mind had time to react. Sometimes Kenji succeeded, sometimes he didn't. But T-shirt cared only about the moments when awareness surpassed intention. One afternoon, while the wind stirred through bamboo leaves, T-shirt thrust his staff toward Kenji without warning. Kenji's sword rose instantly, blocking the strike before he even registered the attack. But instead of praising him, T-shirt simply asked, "Who moved first, the sword or your thoughts?" Kenji paused, realizing he hadn't thought at all. His body had acted as if guided by a current he didn't control. This was the transformation T-shirt had been waiting for. Kenji's awareness widened in surprising ways. He began to perceive shifts in T-shirt's posture before movement occurred, not visually, but as a kind of energetic ripple. His breath aligned naturally with his footwork. His strikes carried precision without effort. Even the sounds of the forest seemed to blend into his training, the rustle of leaves, the sway of branches, the soft crunch of soil under his feet. Everything became part of a single flowing experience. Yet T-shirt constantly warned him, "Do not cling to this ease. The moment you try to possess it, it will slip away." And T-shirt was right. On days when Kenji tried to force the feeling of flow, it evaporated instantly. His body tightened, his timing faltered, and his mind flooded with frustration. But when he stopped chasing it, when he allowed himself to simply move, the ease returned naturally. This cycle repeated for weeks: flow, struggle, ease, collapse, rise again. But Kenji slowly learned the hidden truth: mastery is not a constant state, it is a rhythm. A breathing. An ebb and flow between clarity and confusion. One evening, while practicing under lantern light, Kenji caught T-shirt watching him with an expression he had never seen before, quiet pride mixed with recognition. "You are beginning to disappear," T-shirt said. Kenji frowned. "Disappear?" "Yes," Teacher replied. When the self dissolves, the sword becomes free. Your movements become the moment itself. Kenji didn't fully understand, but he felt something shifting inside, something profound. The boundaries between thought, body, and awareness were fading, merging into a single presence. And for the first time, he sensed that the true essence of mastery was not about becoming powerful, but about becoming empty. As Kenji continued drifting deeper into this mysterious state between effort and surrender, Teacher introduced a completely new dimension of training, one that didn't involve the sword at all. At first, Kenji was confused when Teacher began giving him tasks that seemed mundane, even meaningless. One morning he was told to gather water from the river using a wooden bucket with a crack along the side. Another day he was instructed to sweep the entire dojo courtyard, only for Teacher to kick dirt over it minutes later and demand he do it again. There were days when Kenji spent hours arranging stones in perfect alignment, only for Teacher to walk over and scatter them casually. At first, frustration consumed him. He had become a formidable swordsman. Why was he suddenly doing chores like a child? Why was he performing tasks that intentionally undone his work? Why was Teacher acting as though mastery had nothing to do with combat? His pride whispered, "This is a waste of time." But Teacher watched quietly, waiting for Kenji's reaction to reveal the truth. One afternoon, after Kenji's carefully aligned stones were once again kicked apart, he snapped, "Sensei, what is the purpose of this? How is any of this training?" His voice trembled with exhaustion and disappointment. Teacher didn't answer immediately. Instead, he picked up a single stone and placed it gently on the ground. "Watch," he said. Then he brushed the stone aside and smiled. "Did the stone complain when I moved it?" Kenji frowned. "Of course not, Sensei. It is a stone." Teacher nodded. "And that is why the stone is free. You, on the other hand, are still attached. You cling to effort, to results, to meaning. You cling to being someone who is progressing. A true master clings to nothing." Those words struck Kenji deeply, and from that moment, he began observing his mind during even the simplest tasks. He noticed how much resistance lived inside him, how much he craved acknowledgement, improvement, validation. Even cleaning the dojo revealed aspects of himself he had been blind to. Slowly, he learned to let go. He performed each task with full presence, without expecting praise or progress. And something remarkable happened. The chores became effortless. The irritation vanished. The cracks in the bucket no longer bothered him. The repetitive sweeping felt calming instead of tedious. He began to understand that Teacher wasn't testing his skill, he was testing his spirit. He was teaching Kenji how to move through the world without resistance, without forcing, without clinging to identity or outcome. One twilight evening, as Kenji carried water toward the dojo, he realized the crack in the bucket no longer mattered. The water that spilled onto the ground shimmered in the fading sunlight like drifting stars. And suddenly, he understood, every drop served its own purpose, whether it reached the bucket or returned to the earth. Teacher, watching from a distance, murmured, "Good. You are beginning to learn the art of being empty. Only an empty vessel can receive the whole truth." In that moment, Kenji understood that mastery was no longer about sharpening his sword, it was about softening himself. As the weeks unfolded, Kenji noticed something unusual happening inside himself, something he had never experienced during the years of physical training, sparring, or disciplined repetition. It wasn't a sudden breakthrough or a dramatic transformation. It was far quieter, like the gentle loosening of a knot he didn't even realize he had spent his whole life tightening. His movements became softer, not weaker. His breath slowed on its own. His awareness spread outward instead of collapsing inward. Where he once felt the heavy pressure of striving, he now felt a subtle lightness, as though every action carried less friction. Teacher observed these shifts with the subtle eye of a master who could detect transformation in the smallest gesture. But instead of celebrating Kenji's growth, he pushed him further into unfamiliar territory. One morning, teacher instructed Kenji to enter the forest alone and move without the sword. Today, he said, you will walk without intention. No goal. No direction. No destination. Simply let movement arise. Kenji wandered into the forest, unsure what to do. At first, he walked with purpose out of habit, straight path, steady breaths, alert senses. But then he remembered Tishi's instruction, no intention. So he stopped. He stood still until the need to take action faded. Only when his mind quieted did his body move again, softly, naturally, without decision. Sometimes he walked toward the sound of flowing water. Sometimes he stepped over roots without fully registering them. Sometimes he simply stood and felt the wind brush through the leaves. For the first time, he felt the world moving with him instead of around him. Later that day, Kenji returned to the dojo, unsure of what he had accomplished. Teacher asked only one question: when you moved, did you choose the movement? Kenji hesitated. No, he said. It felt like the movement chose itself. Teacher nodded. Good. That is the doorway. Over the following days, Kenji's training consisted of activities that blurred the line between action and awareness. Teacher would call his name suddenly, and without thinking, Kenji's body would turn. He would drop a bamboo stick unexpectedly, and Kenji's hand would catch it before his mind reacted. These weren't reflexes, they were expressions of a deeper intelligence awakening inside him, the quiet merging of the body-mind and the spirit-mind. But the real test came at dusk one evening, when Teacher surprised him with a swift strike from behind. There was no warning, no sound, no preparation. Yet Kenji moved instantly, not blocking, not attacking, but simply flowing out of the strike's path. His footwork adjusted in perfect harmony with the direction of attack, as if guided by the motion itself. And then he realized something astonishing: he hadn't experienced fear. There had been no hesitation, no mental calculation, no rush of adrenaline. The movement had been pure, effortless, almost serene. Teacher approached him slowly, eyes softer than ever. Now you begin to understand, he whispered. You are no longer fighting. You are listening. When the world speaks through movement, the true warrior does not respond, he resonates. In that moment, Kenji knew he was standing at the edge of something vast, something he could not yet name but could unmistakably feel, a silent power waiting to be revealed. In the days that followed, Kenji felt as though he were living between two worlds, the world he had always known, where effort shaped progress, and a new world emerging beneath the surface, where effort no longer seemed necessary at all. It was disorienting. Some mornings he would wake feeling light and fluid, moving with an ease he couldn't explain. Other days his thoughts returned, loud and demanding, pulling him back into old habits of overthinking and forcing. But Teacher reassured him that this fluctuation was natural. Flow is not a place you enter, he said. It is a tide you learn to ride. The training became increasingly paradoxical. Sometimes Teacher would instruct Kenji to perform a familiar kata, but before he could complete the first motion, Teacher would interrupt. Too intentional, he'd say. Other times, Kenji would begin without thinking, and Teacher would nod approvingly, only to challenge him moments later with an unexpected strike or a sudden change of rhythm. The goal was no longer precision, it was responsiveness without interference. One afternoon, while practicing near the riverbank, Kenji attempted to recreate the effortless feeling he had experienced during Tishi's surprise attack. He tried to clear his mind, tried to relax, tried to surrender. But the more he tried, the heavier his movements became. His steps lost their grace. His grip tightened. His breath grew uneven. Frustration bubbled up within him. Teacher approached quietly. You are trying to force water to flow uphill, he said. The moment you try to control the mind tightens. The moment you try to stop thinking, the thinking grows stronger. He pointed toward the river. Watch. Kenji observed the water gliding smoothly over rocks, adjusting instantly to every curve and obstacle. Do you see effort? Teacher asked. Kenji shook his head. No. Just movement. Teacher smiled. Exactly. Water flows not because it tries, but because it follows its nature. You must learn to follow yours. That night, Kenji meditated alone under the moonlight, listening to the sound of his breath blending with the rustling of leaves. He suddenly realized the truth Teacher had been hinting at: as long as he remained invested in becoming a master, he could not become one. The desire to attain mastery was itself the barrier. True mastery wasn't something he could reach through striving, it was something that appeared only when striving disappeared. The next morning, something subtle but profound shifted. Kenji no longer tried to empty his mind. He no longer tried to control his movements. He simply allowed himself to be fully present, feeling the weight of the sword, the warmth of the sun, the rhythm of his breath. When Teacher launched an attack, Kenji didn't react so much as he aligned with the moment. His sword moved, his feet adjusted, his body pivoted, all without intention. There was no sense of doing, only happening. Teacher lowered his weapon and nodded with deep satisfaction. Now, he said, you are beginning to understand the third gate. Not by reaching for it, but by releasing everything that kept you from seeing what was already within you. For the first time, Kenji felt it too, a quiet understanding rising from somewhere deeper than thought. A glimpse of a world where nothing needed to be forced, and everything unfolded naturally.